Thanks so much for joining us for our fourth episode and first feature episode of LIRS Culture Kitchen. My name is Krish Vignarajah, and I'm the president and CEO of Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service. Today, we're joined by a longtime member of the National Volunteer Group Peace Corps Community for Refugees, Don Drach, and 3 returned Peace Corps volunteers who were at one point refugees themselves. We're so glad to be with all of you and look forward to learning more about your work, your volunteer experience, and your connection to the world of food and nutrition. If you've watched Culture Kitchen before, you'll notice that this episode will be a little bit different. In previous episodes featuring Andy Shalal of Bus Boys and Poets, Stacy Mayan Thong of the 50 Pies, 50 States Project, and Chef Rod Albaran Torres, we've combined conversation with cooking. And even though I couldn't always keep up with them in the kitchen, which I feel like is a bit of an understatement, they're worth a watch. I encourage you to check them out on Facebook or on YouTube. We've had some great discussions and cooked some truly delicious dishes. But today, we won't be doing any cooking, but I promise there will be plenty of fantastic conversation. So for those of you who aren't yet familiar with us, LIRS is the largest faith-based national nonprofit dedicated to immigration and refugee resettlement. So we've been committed to welcoming people from all across the globe for more than 80 years. We decided to start LIRS Culture Kitchen to celebrate immigrant stories, to hear how immigrant chefs honor their culture and heritage in their cooking, and to learn how they have witnessed food bring people together, no matter their backgrounds. In this feature episode, we get to explore the theme of food as a great uniter in depth with an impressive cohort of returned Peace Corps volunteers. They carry with them perspectives from their time spent living and serving in countries around the world. As a reminder to our audience, if you have any questions for our panelists here tonight, please submit your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Don and the return volunteers who will introduce themselves.
Thank you, Krish, and good evening, everyone. All of us at the Peace Corps Community for Refugees welcome this opportunity to partner with LIRS on this feature episode of Culture Kitchen. We're an all-volunteer group comprised of people who served with the Peace Corps, either as volunteers or staff, or those who share our values. And one of our basic motivations for doing this work is pretty simple. We want refugees and immigrants to feel as welcome in our country as we were made to feel in their countries during our Peace Corps service, whether it was 50 years ago, as in my case, or last March, when all 7,300 volunteers worldwide were evacuated from their countries of service because of the pandemic. We're affiliated with the National Peace Corps Association, and we have 2 basic missions. First, we help connect the Peace Corps community with opportunities to volunteer with refugee programs across the country, along the southern border, and in refugee camps overseas, mostly in Lesbos, Greece. And second, we advocate on behalf of refugees at the national, state, and local levels of government, newspapers, social media, and so forth. Now, we don't do this alone. We place a very high value on partnerships, and so we value the partnership that we're developing with LIRS. On an individual level, RPCVs already do volunteer with LIRS. Nate is a naturalization mentor in Denver. Here in Maryland, Mike works as a family mentor. And RPCVs in Northern Virginia have organized packing parties to provide basic household items for refugees settling into their new homes. And on the institutional level, Krish, we're looking forward to partnering with you on a pilot program to connect your affiliate partners with our NPCA affiliate partners to support refugees in their local communities. When I think of partnerships, I think of a proverb I learned when I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Liberia, and it goes like this: if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Krish, we look forward to joining you and your team in Baltimore and with your affiliate partners across the country to go far together to support refugees. And now it's a great pleasure to turn the program over to our panelists, Nye, Suzy, and Peter, who will briefly introduce themselves before talking with Krish about their experiences. Nye, you're up first.
Thanks, Don. Good evening, everyone. My name is Nye. I am originally from Myanmar. Unfortunately, it's a country that is going through a military coup at the moment. I have been in the United States for about 20 years. I came here with my mother and my two younger siblings to join my dad, who was already here as a political asylee in New York City. Um, so when we came over, though, my dad moved down to the south to Georgia. So I grew up in Atlanta. Um, Basically, I went to school here as well in North Georgia. I study international affairs. And it is through that I got to learn about the Peace Corps, and I got to go to Peace Corps in West Africa, Burkina Faso, as a community economic development volunteer. Um, so after the Peace Corps, I wanted to stay in the development world, but I moved to New York City for about 2 years, where I work with a number of nonprofits where we work with homeless prevention or social enterprise that is working with immigrant and low income women. And then after that, I came back to Georgia, where I am here right now. I am a program manager at Georgia Muslim Voter Project, where we do civic engagement, voter registration. Um, right now, we're working on the legislative session at the moment. Yeah, so I'm here with my dog, George, and Kebab. But who knows? Maybe I'll bring them to DC next. Oh, my favorite dish. Sorry, I almost forgot. So my favorite dish, it's called pie paratha. It's like a Burmese dish mixed with like Pakistani Indian influence. It's basically a paratha. You mix it with chicken and potato and cabbage, kind of a stew, and you like mix it all up and eat it. I don't know how to cook it, but my mom, she makes it really, really delicious. So when she makes it, I go and eat it there at her house.
All right, I think I'm up next. Hi, everyone. My name is Suzy Khachaturyan. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I was born in what was the former Georgian Soviet Socialist Republic and is now the Republic of Georgia. And my family and I came to the United States as refugees when I was just a few months old. So unfortunately, I don't have any memories of those early years. We were resettled in Salt Lake City, Utah, and I lived there for most of my life, but I moved to North Carolina about 5 years ago now. I served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Sierra Leone as an education volunteer from 2012 to 2014. And then a few years after I got back, I moved to North Carolina to start graduate school, and I received my Master of Public Health and my Master of Social Work. Now I'm a public policy analyst at a state advocacy and research organization. I've also volunteered and continue to volunteer in various capacities with the immigrant and refugee communities in North Carolina and Utah for over 15 years now. And I can talk a bit more about this later on, but many of you have probably heard of borscht, and that is one of my very favorite foods, and I can speak more to that later, but I'll pass it to Peter.
Hi, everyone. My name is Peter Ter. I was born in the Sudan before it broke apart into two countries. So I immigrated to Jacksonville, Florida, almost 19 years ago. So I will be 20 years in the US in August of this year. So I came to the US as one of the lost boys of the Sudan and was resettled in Jacksonville, Florida by the Lutheran Social Services of Northeast Florida. So I have a very strong connection to Lutheran. So Lutheran did a great job in making sure that I was adjusted very well to the American way of life by letting me read in the library in the church. So I have really good memory of Lutheran social services there in Florida. So I, after that, I went to school in Florida. I did not go to high school. I just took GED and then took the LS, LAT test and then passed it and then went to college and then became U.S. citizen in Florida and then joined Peace Corps after I graduated. And then I worked for a year at the University of Florida International Center, but I wanted to join the U.S. Marine, but the former U.S. ambassador suggested that I should join the Peace Corps, even though he did not serve in the Peace Corps, but he was a U.S. ambassador in Mozambique and in Peru. And he told me the important work that the Peace Corps volunteers were doing. Since I was born into a war, there's no need for me to join the military, but my heart was always in the Marines, but he encouraged me to join the Peace Corps. So, and then I served in 3 countries. I got married, have 2 children, and I'm a federal employee at Peace Corps. So I did not come to the US with my parents. So my favorite food is Vignarajah, which means 3 sisters in Azeri. It's a combination of tomato, pepper, and eggplants stuffed with meat. So if you want to ask me more questions about that, and then I can explain it more to you. So my host mom in Azerbaijan taught me how to cook it. So I like it. It's so delicious. Yeah, so that's it about me. And if somebody want to ask me more about myself, so I can explain that later or in an email. So.
All right, well, that is great. And I do think that those 3 sisters are good flavors to combine. So I am sure we're going to have a lot of enthusiasm to learn more about that recipe. So let me just first say thank you for your introductions. Also, your favorite recipes have already made me start feeling hungry. Maybe it is that kind of time of the day. So I'll just dive right in, and maybe I'll start with food and identity. So at LIRS, we believe that the best way for people to understand refugee and immigrant experiences in America is to know immigrants and refugees in America. You each have, alluded to such unique stories and incredible life experiences. And so I'm excited to dive deeper. So maybe to begin our discussion, I'd like to ask an open-ended question, and anyone can feel free to chime in. How would you say your cultural identity has been influenced by your identity as a former refugee? And how have your relationships to food and nutrition been influenced by that identity?
Go ahead, Naj.
I was letting you go, Peter. You go for it.
Okay. Okay. I think that's a really good question. So number one, I have to answer for that. Number one is that as a refugee, so it's influenced my understanding of world cuisines. So when I was a refugee in Ethiopia, so I learned about Ethiopian food. I ate Ethiopian food. And when we fled to Kenya because we were being bombed by the Sudanese government. And then I learned about Kenyan food. So the identity of my identity as a refugee revolves, around the cuisines of the countries in which we were refugees in. And because Sudanese food is very complicated to cook, so it was easy for us to cook Kenyan food or Ethiopian food. And then, I learned about Somalian food, Ugandan food, because there were so many refugees, Congolese foods from all over Africa. In terms of nutrients, I would say that life in the refugee camp was miserable. So it was about surviving. So we did not really have a good nutritious food. So we did have some fruits that were sold to us by some Kenyans. But the food that we ate in the refugee camp, it was basically for survival. But being a refugee taught me a lot about humanity in the form of food and cuisine. So
All right. So food and identity, basically for me, it comes in the form of where when I got to the States, I was trying to kind of push down and suppress my identity of like my culture food. And the reason for that is basically because uh, okay, first of all, before I say this, not all Burmese food smell horrible. It's just there are some dishes that smells interesting and look interesting. Uh, that doesn't, get to the standard of this idea of like Western fine dining, right? So because it doesn't look and smell like chicken nuggets, as a kid, when my mom is cooking something and she want to share it, uh, at a picnic or like at a team outing or anything, I will always shut it down, right? Because even though I love it at home and I'm all about it, there's this side of me that is now influenced by the West, and I'm just like, oh no, it's okay, like I'll just eat like whatever the school offers. And so that was my identity at the beginning until I went away to college, where I'm like, oh my gosh, like I wish mom could have, um, brought the food over so that I could eat it. And, and even then, that started having me realize like, um, even though there's this fine dining or like there's food that is supposed to look a certain way to be considered delicious and good, um, it doesn't matter where where you're from. It's like there's a show called Ugly Delicious on Netflix. I don't know if some of you know this. It's this idea of like Chef David Shang who tackles this basically everything that you have learned about how a food is supposed to be presented, right? Or how it's supposed to smell. So nowadays, I try to enjoy and be open, and I want to share the food from my country or like that my mom makes with as many people as I can instead of hiding it.
Yeah, and I love that you just mentioned David Chang and Ugly Delicious, because I'm a huge fan of both. I guess when I think about this question, it makes me remember that culture is something that's learned. And I think for me, that process of learning my culture in many ways happened when I got to elementary school, because when you're before elementary school, I was just always, for the most part, other than like daycare, surrounded by family and people of my same culture. And then when I arrived at elementary school, was surrounded by a lot of different folks. In some ways, and I think that's very true for a lot of immigrant children, is they sort of realize that they're different in whatever way that means. Once they reach school and interact with other kids. I think for me, in some ways, it was harmful. Speaking to some of the points that Nai made, like experiencing a lot of shame with food, and I think ultimately kids at a young age, at a certain point, you just kind of want to fit in and not stand out in ways like bringing smelly food to the lunchroom and having to explain that, what you're eating to your friends all the time. So I think in some ways it was harmful. But I think, looking back with 2020 hindsight, it made me like the advocate that I am today in many ways, and just learning how to, develop thick skin at an unfortunately young age, and push back on people that try to otherize you or make you feel like you're not welcome, even if it's kids who ultimately are probably harmless. So yeah, bringing lunch from home taught me to sort of hide my cultural identity when I was younger, and then at some age, just got easier to not have to explain my lunch and just fit in, and then eventually I just grew out of that.
Yeah, thank you all for sharing those insights. And it's really interesting to hear some of the common threads. And frankly, I'm vigorously nodding my head because so much of it resonates with me. I think we all sort of go through this roller coaster ride of when you're younger and you're trying to fit in and assimilate. I remember even eating hot dogs, even though I can't imagine, like to me, it would be so difficult to eat a hot dog today. But you do early on, you just kind of want to eat what the other kids eat, and you don't want to open a, lid of a Tupperware and all of a sudden something that I would describe now as fragrant and rich. At the time you'd be kind of timid and hesitant, and I think it is something that you grow into. So I think that we've covered sort of some of the richness and the positive side of food. I want to talk maybe about what can be a hindrance or a detriment when it comes to food in terms of nutrition in refugee camps, especially as it relates to food scarcity. So since the beginning of the pandemic, many Americans have unfortunately come to know what food scarcity looks like. However, make no mistake, new Americans have disproportionately been affected by the economic fallout caused by the pandemic. At LIRS, we've helped immigrants and refugees put food on the table through an emergency fund we pulled together. It's called Neighbors in Need, and it was in response to the pandemic. But not every immigrant or refugee family has access to emergency safety nets, and food insecurity can be even more pervasive abroad before refugees have the chance to resettle. In fact, we recently heard from a former refugee that the shared food supply they had access to in their former refugee camp would run out each month, and they would just have to not eat for the last few days. So Peter, I'll turn to you for this question. What was your experience with food accessibility and nutrition in refugee camps?
That's a great question, Krish. To give you an answer, it was miserable. My experience was miserable. So in the refugee camp, we did not have access to good food, and we would eat just only once a day because we would have, 1 cup of lentil, 1 cup of corn flour, and all kind, just a little bit of that, So that's what we would have in the refugee camp. So right now, if I were to go back to the refugee camp, the guys, that I used to live with, they would be shocked by how big I am, because when I came to the US, I was very skinny, and I took the picture the next day. Every time I look at that picture, so I was very, I looked like a 15-year-old child. So it was miserable. The reason number one was that the land that we live on in Kenya was not cultivable. So it was barren land. If it was fertile, so we would have been able to cultivate, gardens, and in which we would grow vegetables. So in the refugee camp, it was really, really difficult. So a lot of us would run out of blood because of lack of good food. And so it was not an easy life in the refugee camp. And, I strongly agree with the person that spoke to you about, sometimes we would have that small food, for 1 month, but we would just eat it just only once, a day. If we were to eat lunch, we would finish it in a week. So, and then we would just have dinner in the evening, and then we would just stay, without eating breakfast or lunch, and that's how we would live. And then sometime all of a sudden, and they would tell us, okay, there's no food for the next month, so you would have to make sure that you don't finish up, the food that we already gave you. And that was a big, big, big problem. So a lot of us were emaciated, and it was not, food security was, and I think is still a problem in the refugee camps, not just only in Kenya, but also in other part of the world. But what made it worse in Kenya was that the land was barren. So if it were fertile, we would have been able to cultivate the land and live off it. But it rained just only once a year. So.
Thank you for sharing that. And then I think that the next question I want to talk about is about heritage. So as immigrants, food is such a huge part of our heritage. I know for my family who came to the US from Sri Lanka when I was only a baby, cooking together has helped us keep in touch with our own family's cultural history. Could each of you tell me which foods help tie you and your family together and or to your heritage? And maybe Suzy, could you kick us off with this question?
Yeah, I'm going to turn back to what I mentioned earlier about borscht being one of my favorite foods to this day. My mom has to kind of hide the borscht. Everyone has to, fill up their bowl before Suzy comes over because I love it. So just as a background, I think it's often kind of just described as beet soup, but it's beets, which gives it the red color, potatoes, cabbage, usually some parsley, and then it's typically made with meat. And I think that sort of speaks to, so borscht is a Russian dish. My family is Armenian and we came from Georgia. So I think it sort of hits on something that I think a lot of folks I just generally get a lot of questions about, why we're eating Russian food or why, sort of like asking me to identify where a certain dish is from. But given that, my family is from the USSR, where, there was a heavy Russian influence everywhere. We're from Armenia, but during the time of the Armenian genocide, my family moved north to what is now Georgia. So it sort of speaks to this combination of backgrounds. It's also, my parents' first language is Russian. And I think people are often also baffled by that because they went to Russian schools and again, speaking to the heavy Russian influence in Georgia at the time. So, yeah.
Great. And then Nai or Peter?
For me, so even though my family is Burmese, we're like fifth generation Pakistani, and also I have aunts who are of Chinese descent, and so we're like a mixed bag of like Burmese Muslims, and so for us, whatever mom is cooking with rice, and whoever is around, that's what ties us together. If she's making like some sort of a Chinese dish or like a Burmese dish, um, we're all ready to go and like crash at her place. One running thing that I've been trying to get my mom to do is to write her recipes. And I've even told her to the point of like, look, you do it in Burmese, and I'll like translate it the best I can. And she laughs and she's like, oh, like you think I'm gonna be able to just talk about measurements, and because she doesn't have that, she do like a pinch of salt or whatever. And so it's like a back and forth that we do with my mom. And so yeah, it's really, I guess, like for us it's just a mix of different dishes that have been passed down through families, mainly women in the family, I should say, because they're the ones that are the chefs in our cultures.
And then Peter, did you want to jump in?
Sure. In terms of Sudanese food, I wish if I were separated with my parents, especially with my mom, I think she would have taught me how to cook South Sudanese food. which, every time I think of South Sudanese food, especially ethnic Nuer food. So my family is ethnic Nuer in South Sudan, and they have different type of foods that, every time I think of them, I salivate. But they are very complicated to cook. Only my mom, would taught me how to cook them if she were still with me. So the only food that I think that I can cook is called yod yod. It's similar to Ethiopian hanjera food, and but it's slightly different. So the Nuer food is called kun. The other number one kun, and then the other one is kup, and then the other one is walwal, and those are like labor intensive. Only my mom, if she were with me, would taught me how to do it. I can cook other ethnic foods, such as American food, but not South Sudanese food. So that's all I can add. Part of it is that all my life in the refugee camp, and I did not have access to it since I left home when I was very young. So.
Yeah, no, that's great. It's been interesting in our family. One of my favorite foods is called dosa, and my husband, who's Irish Catholic, loves it. And by contrast, I think now with your family, my mom cooks, but not well. It's edible, but it isn't something where I crave it necessarily. Whereas my father is a very good cook, and my husband, like my father, is very much kind of, I'm by the books. I look at a recipe, I feel comfortable with a recipe, whereas my husband will just kind of, taste and experiment, which makes me very uncomfortable. But what he has done, so if this is a helpful tip, is he actually just kind of observes and has picked it up, so much so that my father is a little bit nervous that he's going to kind of be put out of work because my husband is slowly picking it up. It's not quite the same yet, but he is making market progress. So if that gives you any hope that there is still a way to salvage these recipes, I thought I would share that. I next want to talk about perception. So for the, one of the things I want to pivot to is just how adapting to new diets and foods can greatly change our perceptions of where we move to. So at LIRS, when we welcome refugee families at the airport, we bring them to their new home or apartment. Before their arrival, we ensure their food is filled with culturally familiar foods so that, everything is entirely new and different. Unfortunately, not all immigrants and refugees have this experience and often face intense cultural shock in figuring out what to put on the dinner plate each day. So how did your relationship to food change when you came to the US? Did you have to adapt any traditional family recipes upon coming? What traditional American foods have you come to love? And maybe, Nai, perhaps we could start with you.
Sure. I just had a burger last night. That will be my American go-to, burger and fries, which is really interesting because in Burma, eating burgers and eating fried chicken and things like that is like a cool thing that the youth does and like the new generations do, right? Because it's like this expensive dish that you like go and eat. Then, we get to the States and we go to McDonald's and you can have the dollar menu and it just like blows my mind. And at first I was so happy. I was like, oh my gosh, like this is like so cheap. My parents clearly don't have an excuse to say, oh, it's only on special occasions or anything. And then later on, like as I started to learn about food and how the whole like nutrition aspect of which I'm still like new to and learning even today. I get to notice, I live right outside of Clarkston in Georgia. It's like, I don't know now, but 2 years ago, it was like the most diverse little town in the United States because that's where we have a lot of refugees come in. And at the beginning, before it was starting to get gentrified, you look around and in those in these types of neighborhoods, you're seeing like it's so easy to go to McDonald's. It's so easy to get to Taco Bell, right? It's like so convenient to be like going to Walmart versus you go into like a bit of a uh, upper or like middle class neighborhoods where when you walk around those neighborhoods, you're seeing restaurants that are like that'll list out the calories and things like that. So it's just like a really interesting thing to see. Um, that is like one big shock that I've learned that in lower income neighborhoods across US, you're getting to see fast food chains and then versus.
Great. And Susie, Peter, would you like to jump in? Otherwise, I'll go to the next question.
I could just jump in really quickly and say that, obviously I was too young to remember the early years of resettlement in the States, but having talked to my parents about it, I know that, it required a lot of like one, just like getting to know grocery stores and like being overwhelmed by the insane variety that we have in a typical grocery store here in the States, and just looking at different vegetables and trying to identify what's what. Like, for example, we use a lot of parsley, like what is called Italian parsley in various dishes. And it took like years for my parents to be able to find it in a store. So it's lots of just like staring and looking and figuring out, using like dried herbs instead of fresh herbs, but also still kind of trying to figure out what's what. Obviously the names are different. So yeah, but I agree with Nye that, eating out as a kid, it was like, it was a treat to get fast food. And it just felt very luxurious.
All right, great. So now I want to change gears, and I'd actually like to talk a little bit more in depth about your Peace Corps experiences. So Peter, I'm going to start with you. Did your personal refugee experience influence your interest in Peace Corps?
Sorry. Yes, but not until the U.S. ambassador, Dennis Seagate, that I mentioned earlier, convinced me to join the Peace Corps. So I was interested in giving back to my adoptive country by serving in the U.S. Marine Corps after graduation. So I wanted to go to Marine Corps officer training at Quantico, Virginia. So and then I would go to the U.S. Marine Corps office at the University of Florida in Gainesville, and I would feel at home with them. So and then the ambassador got a form from the U.S. Marine Corps office asking him to fill it out as a reference for me. And then he sent me an email asking me if I could speak with him first before he could fill out that form. And then I went to speak with him, and then he told me that, Peter, I know that you love your adoptive country, but there are so many ways in which you can give back to your adoptive country. So please, I would suggest that you join the Peace Corps. I'm not a returned Peace Corps volunteer, but I did work with Peace Corps volunteers in Africa and in Latin America, and in the Middle East as a U.S. diplomat from all over the world. So my suggestion would be that you can give back to your country, to your adoptive country, by serving in the Peace Corps. And that's how I serve in the Peace Corps, and it's influenced my experience as a refugee, because serving in the Peace Corps and living with different people reminded me of how I was living in the refugee camp, because I got to know people from Azerbaijan, and then after that, I went to serve in China and then live with Chinese people. I learned from my Chinese students. And they taught me everything about China, how to do business in China, how to do things that are culturally appropriate, how to cook Chinese food. They would come to teach me on Saturdays, on the weekends, how to cook Chinese food. And then when I went to serve in the Peace Corps in Georgia, Gamar give us Suzy. That's a Georgian word for hello. So the food that in Georgia was so delicious. And Georgia I love Georgian food. And also I love Georgia, the people of Georgia, because they live very well together. The reason I'm saying this, in between Armenians and Azeri, there are a lot of problems, but in Georgia, the community that I live in, they live side by side. So every place, you know, my refugee experience taught me not to be judgmental, just to be adapted to the new environment that I am. So it taught me to be careful, to not generalize people. And also I learned a lot about human connections. So because of my experiences in different places like Azerbaijan and Georgia and China. So it does have, it's influenced my experience, because it's just a great way to give back. And also in Azerbaijan, I met a lot of refugees, and in Georgia, I met a lot of refugees who used to live in Azerbaijan and then moved to Georgia because of Armenian Azeri situation. And they told me how to eat their food, how to cook it, and that's, I like hajaburi, so Georgian food. So it's, I also love Russian food. I was also salivating when you were talking about Russian food because of my experiences in Azerbaijan and in Georgia. So yes, my experience as a refugee has, you know, play a very positive role in terms of accepting other people's cultures and cuisines and foods without even, you know, making negative comment toward that culture or cuisines.
Wonderful to hear. So I'm going to ask just two more sets of questions before I open it up to audience Q&A. So please, if you have a question and you haven't written it in, please do so. So one question is, did your personal refugee experience influence your interest in the Peace Corps? And then did your Peace Corps experience change how you viewed refugees coming to the US and influence the work you're doing now to advocate on their behalf? So maybe either Suzy or Anai, feel free to jump in.
Oh, I'll jump in now. So in terms of how my Peace Corps experience changed my view of refugees, I don't know that it really changed my view. I do think that it sort of gave me a new platform on which to advocate on behalf of refugees, to the extent that it makes sense. You know, the third goal of Peace Corps, excuse me, is helping to promote a better understanding of other people on the part of Americans. And I think, you know, to the extent that it's appropriate, wielding my identity as both an RPCV and as a refugee really, I think, like, strengthens the advocacy work that I do. And then in terms of how my refugee experience or whether it influenced my decision to do the Peace Corps, I don't think that it necessarily did. I think it gave me a bit of confidence, given my like cultural competency through not only my lived experiences, but also my professional and volunteer experiences.
Sorry, I lost my mouse for a second. So for me, it's actually, it was a big influence on how I viewed refugees. And I say this because, so I never got the chance to experience what it's like to be in a refugee camp. My family came as a political asylee, so we came straight from Myanmar all the way to the United States. And in Burma, you know, there's no middle class, right? You're either like rich upper class or you are really poor and struggling. And I was lucky enough to be born in a family that has some money to be able to come to the States. And even when we were in the States, I was very lucky enough to go to a private school, private high school, and a private college. So, as you can imagine, I was in a bubble with a certain crowd. Okay, before I say this, I love my high school, I love my college, I still have friends and professors that I stay in touch with. But nevertheless, I was in a bubble. And so my views towards immigration and like refugees were like, well, like my family also came here, and if we can do it, and if my dad can like work his way up, why can't any other refugees could do it? And then little did I know, I get sent to a tiny village in Burkina Faso, and it just kind of hit me. Everything just kind of like come to life, all the light bulbs are going off. Um, that it's not as simple as that or like as lucky as that. Everyone has their own unique stories and like struggles that they're going through. Even myself am going through struggles in different ways. Um, and so Peace Corps was a huge, um, I guess, burst of bubble in terms of me being in the sector that I am. Since I've been back, I've worked with IRC, I've worked with organizations that do like homeless prevention, and right now I'm doing advocacy work. Um, so yeah, that's like a big thing. View change, and then how was your experience with um, oh, refugee experience influence the Peace Corps. Um, I would say it would be more of like the way I grew up. My family was surrounded by a lot of Americans who are luckily welcoming in our cases. And growing up, seeing a lot of these adults and my mentors who are always giving back to the community. That when I was looking at next steps after college, um, I feel like I wanted to give back to the country that has given me, in many ways, a lot. So Peace Corps was like the top choice, and I was gone after 3 months of application.
That's great. Okay, wonderful. All right, so now I want to turn to some audience Q&A. Thank you for posing these questions. So one question is from Michael. How did your immigrant experience influence your decision to join Peace Corps? And did your time as a volunteer overseas open up new tastes for different foods? Suzy or Peter, do you want to jump in and answer that?
Sure. I think that's a really good question. So I am speaking to the food part of the question. It really taught me to value different foods from different cultures. So when I was first, in Azerbaijan, I served there for 3 years as a teacher and a teacher trainer. So I learned different type of foods of, Azeri people. And it taught me a lot, about I think of myself as a lucky person because my refugee experience taught me to be respectful to different cultures and to value who they are. But the most important thing to me as a Peace Corps volunteer was learning the language. There's no better way, in my view, to understand a culture than learning the language of that, local community. Because when you learn the local language, people would be interested in teaching you about it. My host mom did not speak English, but after I learned Azeri and Turkish, so she taught me everything, how to cook Azeri food, and I brought a lot of Azeri cookbooks with me. So I had to spend a lot of money mailing them back, mailing them to the US. I think food has been the most important part of my life. I love cooking Azeri food. I love eating Georgian food and Russian food. I go to Georgian restaurants here and Russian restaurants here in DC, and Azeri restaurants, and also Chinese restaurants. So the Chinese food that we eat here in the US is is similar to Chinese food. So so the real Chinese food there in Southwest China, so was really good. I think food played a major role in my experiences as a Peace Corps volunteer, as a refugee, because I was exposed to different foods from all over Africa, from Kenya, Tanzania, Burundi, Uganda. So it was an easy process for me to value the cooking of different kind of cultures. So speaking of food, food was the most important thing, but learning the language was very beneficial to me, because people would, speak English, were able to explain to me everything, how to cook the three sisters food.
Great. Suzy.
Yeah, I think for me, when I was talking about, well, and Peter were talking about, wanting to give back, like definitely I wanted to give back as well. But I do think there was this added sort of layer that I don't know that many of my fellow Peace Corps volunteers really experienced, which was just that my parents weren't totally excited about me doing the Peace Corps. They were like, we brought you here as a baby. Like, what in the world are you doing going to live in a village in West Africa? So, convincing them that one, I wasn't going to be on like the first flight back to the States, that I wasn't, that they had raised someone that could stand on their own 2 feet, and like all the things that I'm sure experience, as I'm not a parent, but I can imagine that being a parent and having, your kid leave for the first time, not to like go, and travel, but to go and live somewhere remote that you've never been to. I can imagine how frightening that must be. But they didn't stop me. But there was definitely a lot of difficult conversations about like what it means to be an American, and why I think my parents could definitely empathize with me wanting to, go on this sort of adventure and be a teacher and do all these great things. But it's like, can't you just go and be a teacher like at a Title I school? Like, why do you have to go so far away to do this? So there, just to be transparent, it wasn't easy for them to fully buy into.
Yeah. No, that's really great. So I'm going to try to get to a couple questions more before we wrap up. So one question from Aisha is, do you accept new volunteers? So I take that may be directed at LIRS, so I will take the moderator's prerogative to say absolutely. Our work is really kind of labor intensive, whether it is greeting refugees as they literally initially arrive at the airport, to helping, as I said, set up their initial apartment that they'll move into, to driving them to English as second language courses, to mentoring little kids. All of that really requires volunteers and staff. So please stay in touch in terms of if you want to get more engaged and learn about volunteer opportunities with LIRS. Another question that we have is from an audience member. How did your Peace Corps cultural shock going to another country compare to coming to the US? Anyone want to take that one?
That's a really good question. So when I arrived in the US, I was kind of shocked, because when I was in the refugee camp, I was living a primitive life. I did not have access to modern technology. I never used a phone before, let alone computer. The first time I saw a phone was when I was in a hotel in Nairobi on my way to the US. So I saw a computer for the first time in 2001 when I arrived in this country. So I had to learn a lot of things, but I was kind of lucky that I was already literate in the refugee camp before I immigrated to the US, and which was very beneficial to my adaptation to the American way of life. And I was also receptive to so many Americans, kind-hearted Americans, who were willing to befriend me. So they taught me a lot, and they made me feel patriotic about what it means, to be a part of this country. As to be honest with you, if you are a person of color in Eastern Europe, especially, in the Caucasus region or Central Asia, you have to have a thick skin. So, and you would have to face a lot of discrimination. But my experience in the in Azerbaijan was that I don't like generalizing people. Even the people who did not welcome me in the community, so I did not judge them. I just said to myself, Peter, gave them an opportunity to get to know me instead of just saying, oh, they are racist, Peace Corps, please come get me, send me back to the US. And the people who did not welcome me in Azerbaijan became emotionally attached to me, and they still send me letters, that make my life worth living until today. So they wonderful people. I think giving people the opportunity to get to know you is very important as a person of color in that part of the world. And then the other thing was that discipline is very important. So I stayed with my host family. I did not live alone where I was in Azerbaijan and also in Georgia. So I would stay I lived for 3 years with my host family. It was not easy, but it was amazing. So I think discipline is very important, but the thing that I did was kind of extreme. So I would not encourage other volunteers, to do them part of it, because I was born into living a hard life in the refugee camp. So the hard life that I experienced in the Peace Corps was nothing compared to the life in the refugee camp. Okay, thank you.
That's great. And then, and I also want to, Don, please, if there's anything that you want to jump in terms of even kind of volunteering, would love to kind of hear your take. I'll maybe come back to you just after I pose the last two questions that I think we'll get to, which are similar. So one is, what nutritious food can be found exclusively in your country, and what's the best food in the world?
To be diplomatic, all food are the best food in the world, even if they if they do not taste good to me. I think different people enjoy eating their food, and I think, to be honest with you, I think the best food in the world is everywhere. But Uzbekistan, I volunteered there for 10 days. I think they have the best food in Central Asia. So, and but that's a really good question. But I would go neutral. So even if I don't like food, so I always ask if other people like it, it's best for them. So what is best for me will not be best for them. So I think, to me, all food, are best, to people who eat them.
Very diplomatic. Don or Suzy Nye?
Sorry, Peter. I'm gonna have to disagree on that one. I gotta say, I feel like you guys know what's coming. The best food will be like my mom's kitchen. Whatever she's making is just amazing. There's like nothing compared to it. But yeah, I would say it would be her food.
I always thought that food in Singapore was the best in the world until I went to Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. And my son-in-law is from Malaysia by way of Sri Lanka, and I've never had better food there. The Peace Corps answer to that question might be the food you're eating at the moment and the people you're with.
Yeah, I would, I can relate to all the answers. I like Peter's approach. I love my mom's cooking, but I also really, really miss the foods that I ate in the Peace Corps. I know some volunteers didn't do well with eating the same foods or the same, kinds of foods every single day, but I could do it very easily for many, many more years. So I'm really missing my, rice and plus sauce in Sierra Leone.
Okay, I am salivating. I know that for some, I may be what stands between you and dinner. So I'm just going to quickly end with a few final remarks. So before we close, I just want to let our audience know that they can follow our work at LIRS on all of our social platforms. So Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at the handle @LIRS.org. You can also learn more about ways to get involved at lirs.org/volunteer and engage directly in advocacy efforts as well through our LIRS advocacy alerts, which are found at lirs.org/advocate. You can also visit our LIRS homepage to sign up for our newsletter with updates and additional events and opportunities too, including our next Culture Kitchen, which will be around Mother's Day. Make sure to keep up with Peace Corps Community for Refugees by following them at the handle at PCC4 Refugees. And if you are part of the Peace Corps community and want to get involved with the group, you can contact Don and learn more at www.ppc4refugees.org. You can find all the links, handles, and emails in the chat box, so check that out. And let me just end by saying thank you so much for joining us, Nye, Peter, Suzy, and Don. It has been such a pleasure, and thanks to our audience for participating and contributing to today's discussion. Keep an eye out for the announcement of our next LIRS Culture Kitchen event, which will have me back at the stove. Have a great evening, and thanks again for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.